heard my son's voice through the haze of machines and monitors. How soon can we access his accounts? The words hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't dead. I wasn't even unconscious anymore. But there he was, my own flesh and blood, asking the doctor about my money while I lay there fighting for every breath. Would you forgive someone who asked about your money before asking if you'd live? Comment, forgive or never. The audacity was breathtaking. But they didn't know I could hear them. They thought the old man was finished, his mind gone, his will broken. They were wrong on all counts. What they didn't understand was that my body failing didn't mean my brain had stopped working. They thought I was unconscious, but cardiac arrest doesn't always mean brain death. My body was weak, machines doing half the work my heart should have been doing, but my mind was sharp as ever. Sharp enough to hear every word my son spoke to the doctor in what he thought was a private conversation. The power of attorney should give me immediate access, right? My son's voice carried the confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. I mean, look at him. He's barely responsive. We need to act quickly before the accounts get frozen or tied up in legal complications. The doctor shifted uncomfortably. These situations are complex. Medical incapacity doesn't automatically mean. But he can't even speak clearly, my son interrupted. Yesterday he couldn't remember my wife's name. This is exactly why we set up the power of attorney in the first place. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady, but rage was building in my chest like a fire. The boy was already spending my money in his head, already planning his inheritance while I was still drawing breath. The joint checking account has about 40,000. My son continued, pulling out his phone. The investment portfolio should be worth at least 200,000, maybe more with the recent market gains. And the house is fully paid off. That's another 300,000 in equity. He had done his homework. He knew exactly what I was worth, down to the last dollar. The house I'd worked 60-hour weeks to pay off. The investment accounts I'd built over 30 years of careful saving. The checking account that held the last of my wife's insurance money. My son stepped closer to my bedside, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a whisper. How soon can the bank transfers happen? I've already called First National, and they said with the power of attorney paperwork, we could move the joint account funds as early as tomorrow. Tomorrow? He wasn't even waiting for me to die. He was planning to drain my accounts while I lay there breathing through a tube. I need to contact the investment firm too, he continued. Schwab holds most of his portfolio, and I want to make sure those accounts don't get locked up if his condition worsens. The house deed is already in my name as joint owner, so that's secured. The words hung in the air. Joint owner. I had never made him joint owner of my house. I had put him as my heir in the will, but joint ownership? That was news to me. Either he was lying to the doctor, or he had found a way to change documents I didn't remember signing. My chest monitor beeped faster, and the nurse glanced over. I forced my breathing to slow, my heart rate to settle. I couldn't give myself away now, not when I was learning exactly how deep his betrayal ran. The investment accounts should transfer clean, my son said, scrolling through his phone. I've got the account numbers, and the power of attorney covers all financial decisions. By the end of the week, everything should be consolidated under my control. By the end of the week, he had this timed out like a military operation. While I was fighting to stay alive, he was executing a financial takeover. The doctor cleared his throat. I have to advise caution here. Legal and medical capacity are two different things. Your father's cardiac event doesn't automatically mean he lacks the mental competency to make his own financial decisions. Look at him, my son said, and I felt his shadow fall across my bed. He hasn't said a coherent sentence since he got here. Yesterday he asked for his mother. She's been dead for 15 years. This morning he couldn't remember what year it is. If that's not cognitive impairment, what is? But that wasn't cognitive impairment. That was strategy. Every confused word, every blank stare, every moment of apparent disorientation had been calculated. I needed time to think, time to plan, and the best way to buy that time was to let them believe I was more damaged than I was. I'm calling the bank again this afternoon, my son announced. And I need to reach out to his employer about the retirement funds. There's probably another 50,000 sitting there that needs to be rolled over before it gets complicated. 53,000, actually, in a 401k that he had no legal right to touch. But he was already counting it as his own. The doctor left, and my son immediately pulled out his phone. I listened as he dialed First National Bank, the same bank where I'd done business for 22 years. "This is regarding my father's accounts," he said when someone answered. "I have power of attorney, and I need to discuss transferring funds from our joint checking to my personal account. His medical condition has deteriorated, and I need to consolidate his finances. Our joint checking." He was already calling it ours, as if he'd earned a single dollar of what sat in that account. "Yes, I can come in this afternoon with the paperwork," he continued. "How much can we transfer in a single transaction? The account has about 40,000, and I'd prefer to move it all at once. All at once. Clean and quick, like stripping a carcass. No consideration for what I might need for my own medical bills, my own recovery." He wanted every penny transferred before I had a chance to wake up and stop him. I heard him make a second call to Schwab, asking about accessing my investment portfolio. Then a third call to someone about property transfers and inheritance procedures. He was working his way through my entire financial life like a methodical thief. But he had made one crucial mistake. He assumed that physical weakness meant mental defeat. That cardiac arrest had made me helpless, confused, unable to fight back. The truth was exactly the opposite. Lying in that hospital bed, listening to him divvy up my life's work, I had never been more focused, more determined, more ready to wage war. He thought I was finished. But I was just getting started, and I would let him believe I was more confused than I really was. The best defense is letting your enemy think they've already won. My body was failing me, no question about that. The cardiac arrest had left me weak as a newborn, dependent on machines for half the functions my body used to handle automatically. My hands shook when I tried to hold a cup of water. My voice came out in whispers when I tried to speak. Walking to the bathroom required a nurse's assistance and left me exhausted for hours. But weakness of the body doesn't mean weakness of the mind. And I was going to use that confusion to my advantage. When the doctor came for his morning rounds, I made sure to seem more disoriented than I actually was. "Where am I?" I asked, even though I knew exactly which hospital I was in and how long I'd been there. "Is Margaret coming to visit?" Margaret had been dead for 3 years, but asking for her sold the story of cognitive damage. "You're in the hospital, Mr. Thompson," the doctor said gently. "You had a cardiac event. Do you remember what day it is?" I stared at him blankly for a long moment, then guessed wrong on purpose. "Tuesday?" "It's Thursday," he corrected. "How are you feeling today?" "Tired," I mumbled, which wasn't a lie. "My chest hurts." "When can I go home?" The doctor made notes on his chart. Behind him, I could see my son watching carefully, taking mental inventory of every confused response, every blank stare. He was building his case for cognitive impairment, and I was helping him do it. But the moment visiting hours ended and the family left, I became a different man entirely. I waited for the hallway to quiet, for the nurses to finish their rounds, and then I reached for the bedside phone. My lawyer picked up on the second ring. "Robert Walsh speaking." "Bob, it's me." My voice was stronger now, more focused. "I need you to come see me. Tonight, if possible. There's been a development with my son. Are you all right? I heard you had a heart attack. I'm alive, and my mind is sharp. But I need legal advice, and I need it fast. My son thinks I'm mentally compromised, and he's already making moves on my accounts." Bob arrived at 9 that evening, when the hospital was quieter and family visitors had gone home. I told him everything I'd overheard, every phone call my son had made, every plan he'd outlined to the doctor. "He's already contacted First National about the joint checking account," I explained. "And he's planning calls to Schwab about my investment portfolio. He thinks the power of attorney gives him immediate access to everything." Bob pulled out a legal pad and started taking notes. The power of attorney document we drafted last year does give him broad financial authority if you're incapacitated. But incapacity has to be medically determined and documented. That's the problem. He's using my physical condition to argue mental incapacity. And I've been playing up the confusion to buy myself time to think. Smart move, Bob said. Physical weakness after cardiac arrest doesn't automatically equal legal incompetency. The standard is whether you can understand the nature and consequences of your decisions. Can you? Perfectly. I understand exactly what my son is trying to do, and I want to stop him. During the day, I continued my performance. When my daughter-in-law visited, I pretended to forget her name. When my son asked about my bank account passwords, I claimed I couldn't remember them. I asked the same questions repeatedly, seemed confused about basic information, and generally acted like a man whose mind had been damaged by his medical trauma. But every moment they thought I was mentally absent, I was actually gathering intelligence. I listened to their conversations in the hallway. I heard my son on the phone with various financial institutions. I learned that he'd already spoken to someone at my former employer about my retirement benefits. The scope of his planning was breathtaking. He wasn't just looking at the obvious accounts. He'd researched my entire financial footprint and was systematically working through each asset, each account, each potential source of money. Dad seems pretty out of it. I heard my daughter-in-law tell someone on the phone. He asked me 3 times who I was yesterday. Michael thinks it might be permanent damage from the lack of oxygen. Perfect. Let them think the old man's brain was scrambled. Let them believe their plan was working flawlessly. But during my second secret meeting with Bob, I learned something that changed everything about my approach. The confusion you're experiencing, or appearing to experience, could actually work in your legal favor, Bob explained. If you make changes to your financial arrangements now, while appearing to be cognitively impaired, it creates a kind of legal shield. Anyone challenging those changes later would have to prove you lacked capacity at the time you made them. So cognitive fog becomes legal cover? Exactly. The medical team here has been documenting your recovery, including your mental status. If their records show you were lucid enough to understand basic decisions, that creates a legal foundation. But if observers think you were more impaired than you actually were, it makes challenges harder. That was when I realized I could weaponize my apparent confusion. Every moment my family thought I was mentally absent, I could be making concrete legal moves to protect my assets. The performance of incapacity could become the very tool I used to maintain control. The next afternoon, when my son stepped out to make his daily round of phone calls to financial institutions, Bob returned with revised legal documents. We met in a small conference room the hospital used for family meetings, and I carefully reviewed every change to my power of attorney, every modification to my beneficiary designations. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a confused old man trying to understand paperwork that was beyond his comprehension. I asked Bob to explain the same clauses multiple times. I seemed uncertain about basic decisions. I appeared to struggle with concepts I'd understood perfectly for decades. But I understood every word, every implication, every legal consequence of what I was signing. By the time my son returned from his phone calls, confident that his father was too confused to interfere with his financial takeover, the legal trap was already being set. The distinction he failed to understand would cost him everything. Medical incapacity and legal incompetency are 2 very different things. A distinction that would cost my son everything. Bob sat across from me in that sterile conference room, his legal pad covered with notes about power of attorney documents and financial capacity evaluations. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while he explained the legal reality my son had completely missed. Your cardiac arrest put you in medical crisis, Bob said, his voice low and measured. Your body failed you. Your heart stopped. The machines kept you alive. But none of that affects your legal standing unless a court declares you mentally incompetent. I leaned forward, my chest still aching from the procedures. My son thinks the heart attack scrambled my brain. Physical weakness doesn't equal mental incompetence. The law recognizes that someone can be medically compromised, but still possess full cognitive ability to understand their financial affairs and make legal decisions. Bob pulled out the original power of attorney document we'd drafted the year before. This gives him broad authority if you become incapacitated. But incapacitation has specific legal requirements. It's not automatic just because you had a medical emergency. The distinction was crucial. My son had assumed that cardiac arrest equals cognitive damage, that medical incapacity automatically triggers legal incompetency. He was operating on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the law works. What does the law actually require to prove someone lacks capacity? I asked. Bob flipped through his notes. The person has to be unable to understand the nature and consequences of financial decisions. They have to be incapable of processing relevant information or making rational choices based on that information. It's a high legal bar, higher than my son realized. He saw me struggling to walk to the bathroom and assumed my mind was equally damaged. He heard me asking confused questions and concluded I couldn't understand complex financial matters. He watched me seem disoriented and decided I was legally helpless. But the law doesn't work that way. Cognitive capacity is presumed unless proven otherwise through formal legal proceedings. My apparent confusion was just that, apparent. Strategic. Calculated. The medical team has been documenting your recovery, Bob continued. Your chart shows improving cognitive function. Yesterday's neurological assessment noted that you were oriented to time, place, and person. You answered questions appropriately. You demonstrated understanding of your medical situation. Perfect. While my family saw a confused old man who couldn't remember basic information, the medical professionals were building a record of my mental competency. Every interaction with doctors, every coherent response to medical questions, every demonstration of understanding was being documented. So when I signed the revised power of attorney documents yesterday, I was legally competent to do so. Absolutely. Your medical condition doesn't invalidate your legal capacity to make financial decisions. Your son's assumption that cardiac arrest equals mental incompetence is legally groundless. Bob showed me the legal requirements for challenging someone's mental capacity. It required medical testimony, psychological evaluation, and court proceedings. My son would have to prove that I couldn't understand the nature of my financial decisions, couldn't process relevant information, couldn't make rational choices. But the medical records would show exactly the opposite. They documented a man who understood his medical condition, cooperated with treatment, and demonstrated cognitive awareness throughout his recovery. Your strategy of appearing more confused than you actually are creates an interesting legal shield, Bob explained. If your son later challenges the changes we're making to your financial arrangements, he'll have to prove you lacked capacity when you made those changes. But the medical documentation shows you were competent. The performance of confusion became legal armor. Every moment my family thought I was mentally absent, I was actually making concrete legal moves to protect my assets. The apparent cognitive fog provided cover for deliberate financial restructuring. He's been calling banks and investment firms all week, I told Bob. He thinks the power of attorney gives him immediate access to everything. The original document would have, if you were actually incapacitated. But you're not. And the revisions we filed yesterday change everything about his authority. Bob had explained the legal mechanics during our first secret meeting. Power of attorney documents can be modified or revoked by the person who granted them, as long as that person maintains mental capacity. The modifications don't require notification of the current power of attorney holder. My son was operating under the assumption that his authority was permanent and irrevocable. He thought my medical condition had locked in his financial control. He was systematically working through my accounts. Confident that legal challenges were impossible, he was wrong on every count. The revised power of attorney removes his authority entirely, Bob confirmed. We've designated your daughter-in-law as the new holder. She has no idea about his plans to drain your accounts, and she won't enable his greed. While my son was making phone calls to financial institutions, assuming his power of attorney was unassailable, the legal foundation of his entire plan was being dismantled. The document he was relying on had been legally superseded by new arrangements he knew nothing about. He keeps telling people I can't understand basic financial concepts, I said. Yesterday he told the nurse I couldn't remember my bank account numbers. But you can remember them? Every single one. Account numbers, balances, beneficiary designations. My mind is sharp as it's ever been. Bob made more notes. That's crucial documentation. If he challenges your capacity later, we have witnesses to your cognitive clarity during this period. The medical staff can testify that you understood complex financial discussions, made informed decisions, and demonstrated full awareness of consequences. The legal trap was taking shape around my son's assumptions. He believed his father was mentally compromised and legally helpless. He was confident that power of attorney authority was permanent. He assumed that medical incapacity equaled legal incompetency. But competency is a legal determination, not a medical one. Physical weakness doesn't eliminate financial decision-making authority. And apparent confusion doesn't invalidate legal capacity when medical records document cognitive awareness. My son had built his entire financial takeover plan on legal misconceptions. He thought cardiac arrest had handed him control of my assets. Instead, it had given me the perfect cover to restructure my financial arrangements without his knowledge. The legal difference he failed to understand was that medical incapacity doesn't automatically equal mental incompetency, and his father could still legally modify financial arrangements while appearing cognitively impaired. The specific legal maneuvers were already being put in place. While he was counting my money, I was changing who could access it. Bob returned to the hospital at 10 that evening, carrying a leather briefcase that held the future of my son's financial expectations. The hallways were quiet, visiting hours long over, my family safely at home planning how to spend my assets. They had no idea that their plans were about to become worthless paper. "I've drafted the revocation document," Bob said, settling into the chair beside my bed. "Once you sign this, your son's power of attorney authority ends immediately. No notification required. No waiting period. His legal access to your accounts stops the moment your signature hits the paper." I took the document in my shaking hands. The cardiac arrest had left my grip weak, my handwriting unsteady, but my mind was sharp as a blade. Every word on that page was exactly what I wanted. Every clause was designed to strip my son of the financial control he thought was guaranteed. "How long does he have before his authority is completely gone?" I asked. "It's effective immediately upon execution. The moment you sign this, any actions he takes using the old power of attorney become legally invalid. If he tries to access accounts tomorrow using the revoked document, the banks will reject his requests." But that wasn't enough. Revocation was just the first step. The real power move was choosing who would replace him. "The new power of attorney designates your daughter-in-law as your agent," Bob continued. "She has no knowledge of your son's plans to drain your accounts. She won't enable his greed because she doesn't share it." My daughter-in-law had always been the responsible one in their marriage. While my son spent money they didn't have on toys they didn't need, she balanced checkbooks and paid bills. While he talked about early retirement funded by his inheritance, she worked overtime to cover their mortgage payments. She was the perfect choice to hold financial authority. Careful with money, skeptical of get-rich-quick schemes. Most importantly, she had no idea that her husband was planning to loot his father's life savings while the old man lay unconscious. "Your son assumes his power of attorney is permanent and irrevocable," Bob explained as I signed the revocation document. "He's operating under the belief that your medical condition locked in his authority. He thinks cardiac arrest handed him permanent control of your finances." The audacity was breathtaking. He believed a heart attack made his financial authority unassailable. He thought medical incapacity meant legal helplessness. He was wrong on every count, and his misunderstanding was going to cost him everything. "Most people don't understand that power of attorney can be revoked by the principal as long as they retain mental capacity," Bob said. "Your son has built his entire plan on a legal misconception." While my son was making his daily phone calls to banks and investment firms, confident that his power of attorney gave him unbreakable access to my assets, I was signing documents that stripped him of every bit of that authority. His assumed legal foundation was crumbling without his knowledge. The timing was critical. I needed these changes to take effect before my son could execute his plans for major transfers. He'd already told the doctor he wanted to consolidate my finances under his control by the end of the week. He was planning to move $40,000 from our joint checking account tomorrow afternoon. But tomorrow afternoon, his power of attorney would be legally worthless. The new document grants your daughter-in-law authority over all financial decisions, Bob said as I signed the replacement papers. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, real estate transactions, insurance policies. Everything your son thought he controlled now belongs to someone who won't steal from you. My signature was shaky from the cardiac medication, but legally valid. The notary stamped each page with the official seal that made my son's financial dreams evaporate. Every mark on that paper was another nail in the coffin of his inheritance expectations. He keeps telling people I can't make rational financial decisions, I told Bob. Yesterday he told his wife I couldn't remember my own bank account numbers. But the medical records show you've been lucid and oriented throughout your stay here, Bob replied. The nursing staff has documented your cognitive awareness. The doctors have noted your understanding of complex medical information. If he challenges your capacity to make these legal changes, the hospital records will prove him wrong. The legal trap was elegant in its simplicity. While my family saw a confused old man who couldn't remember basic information, the medical professionals were documenting a patient who understood his condition, cooperated with treatment, and made informed decisions about his care. My son's assumption that apparent confusion meant legal incompetence was about to destroy him financially. When does he find out about the changes? I asked. Not until he tries to use his authority. Banks don't notify former agents when power of attorney documents are revoked. He'll discover his powerlessness the hard way, when his attempts to access your accounts are rejected. Bob placed the signed documents back in his briefcase. The papers that would crush my son's financial expectations were now legally binding. His authority over my assets had been transferred to someone who wouldn't enable his greed. Your son has been operating under several false assumptions, Bob said as he prepared to leave. He assumed your medical condition eliminated your legal capacity. He assumed power of attorney authority was permanent. He assumed no one could challenge his financial control. Every assumption was wrong. The next morning arrived with my son's usual confidence. He strode into my hospital room carrying his phone, ready to make his daily calls to financial institutions. He had no idea that overnight, his legal authority had evaporated. "Morning, Dad," he said, barely looking at me as he scrolled through his contact list. "I'm going to finish up the account transfers today. The bank said everything should be processed by this afternoon." I watched him dial First National, the same bank where I'd done business for 22 years. The same bank that would shortly inform him that his power of attorney was no longer valid. He was about to learn that while he'd been counting my money, I'd been busy changing who could access it. The specific account modifications were already being implemented. The joint accounts he was salivating over were about to become very lonely accounts that I waited until my son left for his daily coffee run before making the call to First National Bank. My voice was still weak from the cardiac medications, but my mind was razor sharp when the customer service representative picked up. "This is regarding my checking and savings accounts," I said. "I need to remove a joint account holder immediately." The representative asked for my account information, my social security number, my mother's maiden name. All the security questions I'd answered hundreds of times over 22 years of banking with them. My son thought I couldn't remember these details, but every number was burned into my memory. "I need my son removed from all joint accounts effective immediately," I continued. "I want these converted to individual accounts under my name only." "Sir, may I ask the reason for this change?" "Personal family matter. I need it done today." The representative explained the process. Since I was the primary account holder and legally competent to make changes, they could process the removal immediately. My son's name would be stripped from the checking account that held $40,000. From the savings account with another $15,000. From the money market account he didn't even know existed. "Will the other account holder be notified of these changes?" I asked. "Not immediately. He'll discover the change when he attempts to access the accounts or receives his next statement." Perfect. My son was operating on the assumption that joint accounts meant permanent access. He thought cardiac arrest had locked in his financial authority. But joint ownership works both ways. Any account holder can modify the account structure, including removing other holders. I gave the bank explicit instructions. Convert all joint accounts to individual accounts under my sole ownership. Remove my son's debit card access. Cancel his online banking privileges. Set up account alerts to notify me of any attempted access or inquiries. The changes will be processed within 2 hours. The representative confirmed. Your son's access will be terminated immediately upon processing. 2 hours. In 2 hours, my son's confident plans to transfer $40,000 would become legally impossible. But removing him from existing accounts was only the first step. I needed to ensure that any future attempts to access my money would be blocked completely. The bank representative helped me establish new beneficiaries for each account. My daughter-in-law became the primary beneficiary on the checking account. Local charities got designated on the savings and money market accounts. My son went from owning half of everything to owning nothing at all. I also need to set up monitoring alerts, I told the representative. If anyone attempts to access these accounts or inquire about them, I want immediate notification. The alerts would be sent to my phone via text message. Any transaction attempt, any balance inquiry, any contact with the bank regarding my accounts would trigger an instant notification. I would know the moment my son discovered his access had been revoked. The timing was critical. My son had told the doctor he planned to consolidate my finances by the end of the week. He was planning his first major transfer this afternoon, moving the entire $40,000 from our joint checking to his personal account. He'd already called the bank twice to confirm the process. But this afternoon, when he walked into First National with his power of attorney paperwork and identification, he would learn that his name was no longer on any account. The joint checking account he'd been counting on was now an individual account he couldn't touch. One more thing, I said to the bank representative. If anyone contacts you about these accounts using power of attorney documents, I want you to verify those documents are current and valid before providing any information. Of course, sir. We always verify legal documentation before discussing account details. My son's revoked power of attorney would be worthless paper. But he didn't know that yet. He was still carrying around the old documents, confident they gave him unbreakable authority over my finances. The bank's cooperation was absolute. They understood that account modifications by competent account holders were routine business, regardless of the holder's medical condition. My cardiac arrest didn't affect my legal right to manage my own money. Within 3 hours, my phone buzzed with the first confirmation. Account modification complete. Joint checking account converted to individual account. Secondary holder access terminated. Another buzz. Account modification complete. Joint savings account converted to individual account. Secondary holder access terminated. A third notification. Account alerts activated. You will be notified of all account inquiries and access attempts. My son returned from his coffee run carrying his phone and a folder of financial documents. He had no idea that while he'd been gone, his access to $40,000 had been completely eliminated. The bank said they could process the transfer this afternoon. He announced to my daughter-in-law, I just need to sign some paperwork and provide the power of attorney documents. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady, but satisfaction was building in my chest. The accounts he was planning to drain were no longer accessible to him. The joint ownership he'd been relying on no longer existed. How much are we moving today? My daughter-in-law asked. All of it. The full $40,000 from checking, plus whatever's in savings. I want everything consolidated under my control before his condition changes. My condition had already changed. I'd gone from being a vulnerable old man with joint accounts to being a strategic father who'd cut off his greedy son's access to every penny. My phone buzzed again. Account inquiry attempted. Access denied. Secondary holder status not found. He was already trying to check the accounts remotely, probably using his online banking access. But that access had been terminated along with his joint ownership status. Every door he thought was open had been slammed shut. The first sign that my son's plans for quick asset access had been completely destroyed came 2 hours later, when First National called him directly. "Sir, we show that you're no longer listed as a joint holder on these accounts. Your access has been revoked." Investment portfolio modifications were already underway. He thought the investment accounts would be his retirement fund. Instead, they became his reality check. The investment portfolio had taken me 31 years to build. Every month, without fail, I transferred money from my checking account to Schwab. $500 when times were good, $200 when work was slow, but something every single month. Through recessions and market crashes, through my wife's medical bills and my son's college tuition, I kept feeding those accounts. The balance had grown to $237,000. My son knew the exact amount because he'd asked me about it during Christmas dinner last year. "Just curious about retirement planning, Dad," he'd said with that false sweetness in his voice. But now I knew he'd been planning his own retirement on my money. I called Schwab from my hospital bed while my son was in the cafeteria, probably calculating how much of my portfolio he could access immediately. The customer service representative was efficient and professional when I explained what I needed. "I want to change all beneficiaries on my investment accounts," I said. "Remove my son from everything. Replace him with charitable organizations." "Certainly, sir. May I have your account numbers and security information?" I rattled off the numbers from memory. Account balances, social security digits, the security questions I'd answered dozens of times over 3 decades of investing. My son thought cardiac arrest had scrambled my brain, but every financial detail was burned into my memory like fire. "I want the American Heart Association as primary beneficiary on the 401k rollover account," I continued. "That's worth about $83,000. The main investment account goes to the local food bank. The Roth IRA goes to the Children's Hospital." The representative processed each change methodically. My son's name disappeared from every beneficiary designation, replaced by organizations that actually helped people instead of exploiting them. Organizations that deserved support instead of demanding it. "These changes are effective immediately," the representative confirmed. "The previous beneficiary will not be notified of the modifications." My son had no idea that while he was planning his financial takeover, his inheritance was being redirected to feed hungry families and fund medical research. The portfolio he'd been counting on was slipping through his fingers like sand. But beneficiary changes were just the beginning. I needed to ensure my son couldn't access these accounts while I was still alive, couldn't manipulate my investment decisions during any period of apparent confusion. "I also need to revoke access for anyone with power of attorney over these accounts," I told the representative. "No one except me should be able to make transactions or changes, regardless of any legal documents they might present. We can add those restrictions to your account immediately. Would you like us to require additional verification for any future changes?" "Yes. Phone calls only with full security verification. No online changes. No third-party authorization. No exceptions." The security measures would lock my son out completely. Even if he somehow obtained new power of attorney documents, even if he convinced someone I was mentally incompetent, these accounts would remain frozen against his access. My phone buzzed with the first confirmation within minutes. Beneficiary change processed. American Heart Association designated as primary beneficiary. Another buzz. Investment account restrictions activated. Third-party access revoked. The satisfaction was immediate and intense. Accounts worth over $200,000 had just been stripped away from my greedy son. Money he'd been planning to access within days was now permanently beyond his reach. My son returned from the cafeteria carrying coffee and his phone, completely unaware that his retirement dreams had just evaporated. He settled into the chair beside my bed and immediately started scrolling through his contacts. "I need to call Schwab this afternoon," he announced to his wife. "Dad's investment portfolio needs to be consolidated with his other accounts. We can't let those accounts get tied up if his condition worsens." I kept my eyes closed, but rage was building in my chest like a fire. He was talking about my life savings like they belonged to him. Like 30 years of careful investing was his personal retirement fund. How much is in those accounts? His wife asked. Around 240,000, maybe more with recent market gains. The 401k rollover alone is worth over 80,000. Plus, there's the Roth IRA and the main brokerage account. He knew every detail, every account balance, every potential source of money. He'd researched my entire investment portfolio with the thoroughness of a professional thief. But his research was about to become worthless information. His assumptions about automatic inheritance were about to crash into legal reality, and my son dialed Schwab's customer service number, confident that his power of attorney would give him immediate access to detailed account information. I listened as he provided what he thought was sufficient identification. "This is regarding my father's investment accounts," he said. "I have power of attorney and need to discuss consolidating his portfolio." There was a long pause. Then his voice changed, became sharper and more demanding. "What do you mean, no longer authorized?" "I have legal power of attorney over his financial affairs." Another pause. I could hear the customer service representative's voice through his phone, explaining that account access had been restricted and beneficiary information was confidential. "He's in the hospital after cardiac arrest," my son said, his voice rising. "He's barely conscious. How could he have changed anything?" The representative remained professional but firm. Recent account modifications had been processed by the account holder himself. All changes were legally valid and immediately effective. My son's face went white, then red, then back to white as the full scope of his exclusion became clear. "There has to be some mistake," he said, but his voice carried the hollow tone of someone who knew there wasn't a mistake at all. His frantic calls to investment firms began immediately. Each conversation followed the same pattern: confident demands for access, followed by shocked silence as he learned that his financial authority had been revoked. The son's reaction when he discovered the accounts were no longer accessible was a mixture of rage and disbelief, followed by desperate attempts to challenge his father's mental competency. But mental competency challenges would be harder to pursue when the family home he'd been planning to inherit was already being legally restructured. The family home he was already mentally redecorating was about to get a new owner. And it wasn't him. "I built that house with my own hands 32 years ago. Every nail, every board, every piece of trim bore the marks of my labor. The foundation I'd poured myself during weekends in the blazing summer heat. The electrical work I'd learned from library books because we couldn't afford a contractor. The plumbing I'd installed pipe by pipe, joint by joint, until my knuckles were raw and bleeding. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, hardwood floors throughout. A kitchen with custom cabinets I'd built in my garage over 6 months of winter evenings. Crown molding in the living room that had taken me 3 tries to get right. Every improvement, every upgrade, every detail had come from my sweat and my paycheck. The house was worth $320,000 now. My son knew the exact figure because he'd looked up the property assessment online. He'd mentioned it casually during his last visit, commenting on how much the neighborhood had appreciated in value. But there was nothing casual about his interest in that number. While my son was making his frantic calls to investment firms, trying to understand why his access had been revoked, I was on the phone with my real estate attorney. The property deed needed immediate modification, and I wasn't waiting for my discharge from the hospital to handle it. "I want the house transferred into a living trust," I told the attorney. "Remove my son from any inheritance claims completely." The legal process was straightforward but decisive. The living trust would hold the property title, with specific instructions for distribution upon my death. Unlike a traditional will, which had to go through probate and could be challenged by disgruntled heirs, the trust would execute my wishes immediately and privately. "Your son assumes he'll inherit the house automatically," the attorney said. "Most children expect to receive their parents' primary residence. It's a common assumption. But assumptions weren't legal guarantees. My son had built his financial expectations on inheritance traditions rather than actual legal documents. He thought blood relation meant automatic ownership. He was wrong, and his wrongness was about to cost him everything. The living trust eliminated his claims entirely. Upon my death, the house would be sold immediately, with no waiting period, no family consultation, no opportunity for legal challenges. The proceeds would go directly to designated charitable organizations. The American Red Cross would receive half. The local children's hospital would get the other half. The trust bypasses probate completely, the attorney explained. Your son won't have any legal standing to challenge the distribution. The property will be sold and the proceeds distributed according to your specifications. My son had no idea that while he was planning his inheritance was being systematically dismantled. He was still operating under the assumption that the family home would pass to him automatically. That $300,000 in real estate equity was part of his retirement planning. But I decided that organizations dedicated to helping people deserved that money more than a son who tried to loot his father's accounts during a medical crisis. The legal paperwork was executed within hours. The house deed was transferred to the trust. The distribution instructions were legally binding. My son went from expecting to inherit the family home to receiving nothing but the satisfaction of knowing his greed had cost him everything. He keeps telling people he's the joint owner of the house. I told the attorney. Yesterday he told the doctor that property ownership was already secured. Joint ownership has to be legally established through proper documentation. If he's not listed on the current deed, he has no ownership rights. I'd never made my son joint owner of anything. The house deed listed only my name. His assumption that he was already part owner was another legal misconception that would destroy his financial expectations. The living trust offered additional advantages beyond bypassing my son. The property would be sold quickly, without the emotional complications that often delayed family real estate transactions. No arguments about keeping the house in the family. No disputes about market value or sale timing. No opportunities for my son to manipulate the process. The trust also protects the property from any creditors or legal claims your son might have. The attorney added, if he's accumulated debts or faces financial judgments, they can't touch assets held in the trust. My son's financial problems were deeper than I'd realized. The attorney's mention of creditors and legal claims suggested my boy had been counting on his inheritance to solve money troubles he hadn't shared with the family. But his solution had just evaporated into legal documents he couldn't challenge. The timing was critical. My son expected to discuss property transfer options during my recovery. He was planning conversations about deed modifications, joint ownership arrangements, and inheritance acceleration. He thought my medical condition gave him leverage to expedite property transfers. But the property had already been legally restructured without his knowledge or consent. His planned discussions would be pointless because the outcome was already determined. When will he discover these changes? I asked the attorney. Not until after your death, when the trust executes. Living trusts are private documents. He has no legal right to review the contents during your lifetime. The house he'd been mentally redecorating would belong to charitable organizations within weeks of my death. The rooms where he'd planned to live would be sold to strangers. The $300,000 in equity he'd been counting on would fund medical research and disaster relief instead of enabling his greed. My son's assumption that he would inherit the family home automatically was completely unfounded. His expectation that blood relation guaranteed property ownership was legally meaningless. His confidence that my medical condition would expedite his inheritance was strategically backfiring. The family home would generate significant charitable donations instead of funding his early retirement. Organizations that actually helped people would benefit from 32 years of my labor and sacrifice. The legal minimum inheritance law required me to leave him something, but that something would be exactly $1. $1 and the knowledge that his moment of greed had cost him hundreds of thousands in real estate equity. My son's final stroke of entitlement was ensuring the family home would be sold immediately upon my death, with proceeds benefiting causes that actually deserved support. His desperate attempts to challenge the changes were already beginning. When he tried to prove I was mentally incompetent, he only proved how legally competent I really was. My son hired an attorney within 48 hours of discovering his financial access had been revoked. Not just any attorney, he found someone who specialized in elder law and competency challenges. Someone who knew how to argue that cardiac arrest victims couldn't make rational financial decisions. The law firm of Patterson Associates had handled dozens of cases involving family disputes over financial capacity. They knew the legal requirements for proving mental incompetence. They understood the medical evidence needed to challenge someone's decision-making authority. But they didn't understand that their new client's father had been strategically planning for exactly this kind of legal challenge. We need to establish that your father lacks the mental capacity to understand his financial decisions, the attorney explained to my son during their first meeting. The cardiac arrest, the apparent confusion, the inability to remember basic information, all of that supports our case. My son provided detailed examples of my supposed cognitive impairment. How I'd forgotten his wife's name repeatedly. How I'd asked for my dead mother. How I couldn't remember what year it was or why I was in the hospital. The attorney took careful notes. Every example of confusion would become evidence in their competency challenge. Every moment of apparent disorientation would support their argument that I couldn't understand the consequences of revoking power of attorney or changing beneficiaries. But medical records tell a different story than family observations. While my son was documenting my apparent confusion, the hospital staff was recording something entirely different. The nursing notes showed a patient who understood his medical condition, who asked appropriate questions about his treatment, who cooperated with therapy recommendations and demonstrated awareness of his recovery progress. The doctor's assessments recorded cognitive improvement throughout my stay, orientation to time, place, and person, appropriate responses to complex medical information, clear understanding of treatment options and their implications. The neurological evaluation was particularly damaging to my son's case. The specialist had tested my memory, reasoning ability, and decision-making capacity. His conclusions were unambiguous. The patient demonstrated full cognitive function despite physical weakness from cardiac arrest. Your father's medical records contradict the family's observations. My attorney Bob explained when my son's legal challenge was filed. The hospital documented cognitive competency throughout his stay. The competency evaluation requested by my son's attorney took place in a sterile conference room at the courthouse. A court-appointed psychologist administered standardized tests designed to measure mental capacity and decision-making ability. I answered every question correctly, demonstrated clear understanding of my financial situation, explained the reasons for my account changes with logical precision, showed complete awareness of the legal consequences of my decisions. The psychologist asked me to identify my assets and their approximate values. I listed every account, every investment, every piece of property with exact figures. The checking account with $40,000. The investment portfolio worth $237,000. The house valued at $320,000. Can you explain why you removed your son from these accounts? The psychologist asked. He attempted to access my finances while I was medically compromised. I answered clearly. He made calls to banks and investment firms trying to transfer my assets to his control. He assumed my cardiac arrest made me legally helpless. He was wrong. The evaluation continued for 3 hours. Memory tests, reasoning exercises, financial comprehension questions. I passed every assessment with scores that indicated full mental competency. My son's attorney tried a different approach. Maybe the changes I'd made were influenced by medication, by post-surgical confusion, by the emotional trauma of nearly dying. But the medical records showed I'd made these decisions during periods when I was alert and oriented. The bank calls had been recorded as occurring during visiting hours when I was engaging normally with hospital staff. The legal documents had been signed when neurological assessments confirmed cognitive clarity. The timing of your father's financial changes actually supports his competency rather than challenging it, Bob explained. He made these decisions when medical records show he was mentally sharp. If he were truly confused, he wouldn't have been capable of the strategic planning these changes required. The competency challenge was falling apart under the weight of documented evidence. Medical records that contradicted family observations. Psychological evaluations that confirmed mental capacity. Legal testimony that demonstrated clear understanding of complex financial decisions. My son grew desperate as his legal options evaporated. He hired a second attorney, then a third. Each lawyer reached the same conclusion. The medical evidence supported my mental competency. making the financial changes legally unassailable. But the competency challenge created an unintended consequence that would haunt my son permanently. Legal proceedings require detailed documentation of the circumstances surrounding disputed decisions. Every predatory comment he'd made during my medical crisis became part of the court record. His conversations with the doctor about accessing my accounts. His phone calls to banks while I lay unconscious. His detailed knowledge of my asset values and his plans to transfer them immediately. All of it was now documented in legal filings that would follow him forever. The court record showed a son who'd attempted to exploit his father's medical emergency for financial gain, who'd assumed cardiac arrest meant mental incompetence, who'd planned systematic asset transfers while his father fought for survival. Your son's competency challenge has created a permanent legal record of his predatory behavior, Bob informed me. If he tries to challenge your decisions again, this documentation will be used against him. The psychological evaluation report was particularly damaging to my son's reputation. It detailed his assumption that medical incapacity automatically meant legal incompetence. It described his failed understanding of power of attorney limitations. It documented his shocked reaction when his financial expectations were proven legally groundless. My son's attorneys withdrew from the case when additional medical records were subpoenaed. Brain scans that showed no cognitive damage from the cardiac arrest. Mental status examinations that documented steady improvement throughout my hospital stay. Competency assessments that confirmed my capacity to make complex financial decisions. The son's competency challenge not only failed but created a legal record of his attempt to exploit his father's medical condition for financial gain. The broader family was about to learn exactly what kind of person they'd been defending. The family gathering where he expected to discuss my assets became the meeting where he learned he'd lost them all. I called the meeting for Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after my discharge from the hospital. My living room held the same furniture I'd bought 30 years ago. The same oak dining table where we'd shared Christmas dinners and birthday celebrations. The same couch where my grandchildren had fallen asleep watching cartoons. But the atmosphere was different now. Tense. Heavy with unspoken accusations and financial desperation. My son arrived carrying a folder thick with legal documents. His wife followed behind him, her face drawn with worry. My daughter and her husband took seats on the far side of the room, clearly uncomfortable with whatever confrontation was brewing. "Dad, we need to talk about these account changes." My son began before anyone else had even settled into their chairs. "The banks are saying I don't have access anymore. There's obviously been some kind of mistake." I sat back in my recliner and looked at him steadily. "No mistake. You were confused in the hospital. The medications, the trauma from the cardiac arrest, it affected your judgment. We need to get these changes reversed before there are legal complications." My daughter shifted uncomfortably. "What changes are you talking about?" "Dad removed me from all his accounts," my son said, his voice rising. "The checking, the savings, the investment portfolio. Everything. He signed papers he didn't understand while he was medically compromised." "I understood every word," I said quietly. The words hung in the air. My son's face went white, then red. He'd built his entire argument on my supposed mental confusion, and I just demolished his foundation with 4 simple words. "You couldn't even remember Mom's name half the time," he protested. "You asked for Grandma like she was still alive. How could you possibly understand complex financial documents?" I remembered everything that mattered. My daughter looked between us, sensing the deeper conflict but not understanding its source. "Dad, maybe you should explain what happened." I opened the folder I'd prepared for this moment. Bank statements showing the joint account balances. Investment portfolio summaries listing the $237,000 in assets. Property records documenting the house's current value. "Your brother made some interesting phone calls while I was in the hospital," I said, my voice calm and measured. "Would you like to hear about them?" My son's face went completely white. "Dad, I was just trying to protect your interests, making sure your finances were secure, by transferring $40,000 from our joint checking to your personal account." The room fell silent. My daughter stared at her brother in disbelief. My son's wife looked like she'd been struck by lightning. You tried to steal Dad's money while he was unconscious? My daughter asked. It wasn't stealing, my son said desperately. I had power of attorney. I was protecting his assets from getting frozen or tied up in legal complications. You were protecting them by moving them to your own account. I pulled out the hospital records I'd requested, the detailed timeline of my son's financial activities during my medical crisis. He called First National Bank 3 times, Schwab twice. He researched the process for accessing retirement accounts and discussed property transfers with the doctor. While Dad was fighting for his life, my daughter's voice carried a chill I'd never heard before. He knows exactly how much money is in every account, I continued. 40,000 in checking, 15,000 in savings, 237,000 in investments, 320,000 in home equity. He had it all calculated before I was even stable. My son tried to rally family support, appealing to traditional notions of inheritance and family loyalty. This is our father's legacy we're talking about. Money that should stay in the family, provide security for his grandchildren. But his wife was staring at him like she'd never seen him before. You tried to take his money while he was unconscious? I was protecting our future, my son said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad's not thinking clearly. The cardiac arrest affected his judgment. He needs someone to manage his finances responsibly. Like you managed them when you called the bank from the hospital waiting room, I asked. The accusation hit him like a physical blow. His attempts to justify his actions crumbled under the weight of documented evidence. Phone records showing calls to financial institutions. Hospital visitor logs proving he'd been making these calls while I lay connected to life support machines. I heard every word you said to that doctor. I told the room. Every plan you made to access my accounts. Every assumption you made about my mental condition. My daughter's husband spoke for the first time. You actually tried to drain his accounts while he was in intensive care? It's not like that, my son protested. But the words sounded hollow even to him. I detailed the specific comments he'd made about my supposed cognitive impairment. How he'd told people I couldn't remember basic information. How he'd claimed I was mentally compromised and unable to make rational decisions. How he'd used my apparent confusion to justify his financial planning. But I wasn't confused, I said. I was listening and planning. The family's reaction was immediate and decisive. My daughter moved her chair further away from her brother. My son's wife stared at her hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Even my son-in-law, who rarely spoke during family discussions, looked at my son with undisguised contempt. So what happens now? My daughter asked. I explained the new financial arrangements, the charitable beneficiaries on my investment accounts, the living trust that would sell the house and donate the proceeds, the reduced inheritance that reflected my son's demonstrated character. You're giving everything to charity? My son asked, his voice barely a whisper. I'm giving it to people who deserve it. The meeting ended with my family divided in ways that would never heal. My daughter and her husband left with promises to stay in touch and expressions of support for my decisions. My son's wife left alone, having learned things about her husband that would reshape their marriage forever. My son sat in his chair for a long time after everyone else had gone, staring at the legal documents that proved his inheritance expectations were legally groundless. The financial restructuring would have consequences that extended far beyond mere money. Where there once was a greedy son expecting an inheritance, there now stood charitable organizations that would actually appreciate the gift. The final estate planning documents sat on my kitchen table like a battle plan. 3 months had passed since my discharge from the hospital. 3 months since my son learned his financial expectations were legally worthless. 3 months of him making desperate phone calls, hiring attorneys, and begging family members to intervene on his behalf. But the legal structure was ironclad. Bob had crafted the documents with precision that would make a surgeon proud. Every asset, every account, every piece of property had been redirected away from my son and toward organizations that actually helped people instead of exploiting them. The American Heart Association would receive $83,000 from my 401k rollover account, fitting justice for money that would fund research into the very condition my son had tried to exploit. The local food bank got the main investment account worth $127,000. They fed families who couldn't afford groceries while my son had been planning early retirement on stolen money. The Children's Hospital received my Roth IRA, worth $27,000. Money that would help sick kids get better instead of enabling a grown man's greed. The American Red Cross got half the house proceeds when it sold. Disaster relief instead of funding my son's vacation plans. My son made his final attempt at reconciliation on a Tuesday evening in November. He arrived without calling first, carrying flowers from the grocery store, and wearing the contrite expression he'd perfected during childhood punishments. "Dad, I know we've had our differences, but you're still my father," he said, settling uninvited into the chair across from me. "Family should stick together. Blood is thicker than water." I looked at him steadily. "Blood didn't stop you from calling the bank while I was unconscious. I was trying to protect your assets. I was scared you might not make it, and I wanted to make sure your money was safe. Safe in your personal checking account." His face flushed red, but he pressed forward with his rehearsed speech. "I made some mistakes. I was emotional, not thinking clearly. But we can fix this. We can restore the original arrangements. Get back to how things used to be." How things used to be was you planning my financial funeral while I fought for my life. The conversation continued for 2 hours. My son deployed every manipulation technique he'd learned over 43 years. Guilt about family loyalty, appeals to tradition and inheritance expectations, promises of changed behavior and renewed respect. But I'd heard his true thoughts during those hospital conversations. I'd listened to him calculate the value of my life's work down to the last dollar. I'd witnessed him assume my cardiac arrest was his financial opportunity. "The charitable organizations don't need your money," he argued desperately. "They have other donors, government funding, corporate sponsors. But I'm your son, your flesh and blood. Your legacy. My legacy is 37 years of honest work. Your legacy is trying to steal from your unconscious father." The flowers wilted in their cheap plastic wrapper as our conversation died. My son left without achieving any reconciliation or financial restoration. The legal documents remained unchanged. The satisfaction I felt wasn't vindictive pleasure. It was the peace that comes from knowing your life's work would serve worthy purposes. The American Heart Association would use my retirement money to fund research that might prevent other families from experiencing cardiac emergencies. The food bank would use my investment portfolio to feed hungry children whose parents worked multiple jobs but still couldn't afford groceries. These organizations understood the value of money because they used it to solve actual problems. They didn't expect handouts or assume they deserved wealth they hadn't earned. They worked for every dollar, justified every expense, and measured their success by lives improved rather than balances accumulated. My son expected inheritance because of genetic connection. These charities would receive donations because of demonstrated merit. The contrast revealed everything about character and worthiness. The permanent nature of the financial changes gave me deep satisfaction. Living trusts and beneficiary designations couldn't be challenged or reversed through family pressure or emotional manipulation. The legal documents would execute my wishes regardless of who approved or objected. My son could hire every attorney in the state, and the outcome wouldn't change. He could rally extended family support, organize intervention meetings, and appeal to every sentiment about blood relations. The money would still flow to charitable organizations when I died. Bob had structured the arrangements to be bulletproof against legal challenges. Medical records documented my mental competency throughout the decision-making process. Multiple witnesses had observed my cognitive clarity during document signings. The psychological evaluation confirmed my capacity to understand complex financial consequences. Even if my son somehow proved temporary confusion or undue influence, the charitable beneficiaries were already legally established. The money couldn't revert to him automatically. It would require entirely new legal proceedings to redirect assets that had been committed to worthy causes. The peace of mind was worth more than the monetary amounts involved. Knowing that my cardiac arrest hadn't handed financial control to someone who'd exploit it. Knowing that my life savings would help people who actually needed assistance. Knowing that greed wouldn't be rewarded with inheritance. The local food bank sent quarterly reports showing how donated funds were used. Meals served, families fed, nutrition programs expanded. Real results from real money solving real problems. My son's reports would have shown vacation expenses, luxury purchases, and lifestyle inflation funded by someone else's sacrifice. The Children's Hospital published annual summaries of their charitable donations. Medical equipment purchased, treatment programs funded, research initiatives supported. Sick kids getting better because donors chose helping over hoarding. My son's version would have shown early retirement funded by his father's cardiac emergency. The American Heart Association detailed their research grants and prevention programs. Studies that might prevent future cardiac arrests, education that might save lives, treatments that might help other fathers survive medical crises. Progress funded by people who understood that money should serve purposes beyond personal comfort. My new financial legacy ensured that my life's work would benefit organizations dedicated to helping others rather than enabling family greed. A single moment of revealing his true nature had cost my son everything he'd expected to inherit. One conversation cost my son $457,000. That's what his inheritance was worth before he asked the doctor about accessing my accounts while I lay unconscious. Every word he spoke in that hospital revealed his true character. Every phone call to my banks showed his priorities. Every assumption about my mental condition proved his moral bankruptcy. He thought cardiac arrest made me helpless. Instead, it gave me perfect clarity about who deserved my life's work. The charities that received my money understood its value because they earned every dollar through service. Assuming someone is helpless can cost everything.